would have been pretty easy to read. They would give you something very easy like that. Or they maybe would give you something that was far more of like a legal definition. They would give you questions from the Constitution. And in all of the classes, if you remember, I had mentioned to you the idea of Selma, Alabama, that movie Selma, where at the beginning the woman goes in and she's taking basically a literacy test, and he starts asking her all these questions, bless you, and she keeps getting it and getting it and getting it. And then he asks her how many judges are in Alabama, and she gets it right. And then he asks her to list all of the judges in Alabama, and she doesn't get it right, and then she's denied the right to vote. So it could have been something that was in a different language. It could have been something that would have been like a legal document. It could have been something very, very easy if they wanted you to read. It could have been stuff dealing with the Constitution. And I'll turn this down, but I did post a video up here, on site no less, from me and a former intern actually talking about some of these different tests. And you'll notice the jelly bean test that's in here. There's a couple of others. There's the soap bubble test. And then you start getting into some of these literacy tests. And these are actually some of the sample questions up here. Name two of the purposes of the Constitution. Congress is composed of blank. I don't even know how to answer that question. If two houses of Congress cannot agree on adjournment, who sets the time? And some of these are valid questions. I'm not saying that they're not. But I guess what I'm really saying is these would be very, very difficult questions for somebody, especially if they didn't have a lot of education, which freedmen or oftentimes poor whites would not have had. So take a look at this video because it's actually pretty good. So literacy test, the jelly bean test, the soap bubble test. There are two more. Go ahead, Phil. Okay, two more before we move on to Phil's question. Any others? Two easy ones.
Wasn't one of them the grandfather?
What was the grandfather clause?
Wasn't it if your grandfather was a slave, you couldn't vote?
You're really close. Basically, if your grandfather could vote if your grandfather could vote prior to the abolishment of slavery, then you would be allowed to vote. And this one was, to me, the one that was the most dubious because it's based seemingly on previous condition of servitude or race, or both of them, in fact. But to be honest with you, there would have been a lot of poor whites whose grandfathers would not have been allowed to vote too. So, because they wouldn't have had enough property, that kind of a thing. So there was the grandfather clause. And then what was the last one? The poll tax. How'd the poll tax work? Go ahead, Andrew.
You had to pay for it, but you had to hold your receipt. And that could have been like, you could have been holding on that receipt for like 6 months, 3, 4, 6 months or whatever.
Yeah, you're right on this. They'd have to pay. And these poll taxes were oftentimes set maybe between $1 and $5. Do you know what they would approximately be worth now if you wanted to pay if you had to pay a poll tax? Some instances it could go up to about $50. And I'll tell you, if I had to pay $50 to vote, I'd probably think twice about it. But understand on this, you mentioned the idea of the receipt. Part of this would have been, okay, they wouldn't have been able to pay, which would have denied, again, freedmen, poor whites, the right to vote. Part of this would have been that they would have had to have paid a certain amount of time in advance, and then they would have had to have held on to the receipt. So if they showed up the day of the election or a week before the election or something like this to pay a poll tax, they wouldn't have been allowed because they would have missed the deadline. But if they did pay it on time, then they'd have to carry around that receipt or keep up with that receipt for months sometimes, and they'd have to verify that in fact they had paid. And I had mentioned to y'all, how many of y'all bought something yesterday and still have the receipt? Well, a lot of y'all are like, no, I didn't have the receipt from what I bought today. So when you put that into context, it becomes kind of a difficult thing. The poll tax was one of the harder ones. Go ahead, Phil. I saw you had a question.
Well, most of these tests that we're talking about, like the bubble tests and down market, will it be on the exam itself?
Well, that's why we're going over it, Phil. That's why we're going over it. And like I said, there's a video up here. 15th Amendment and voting rights tests. Seems like the last intern video was pretty prominent on the exam. Maybe that's a hint. Oh, wow, I didn't even spill it. What other questions have y'all got? From any of the terms, or we'll get in. Go ahead, Phil.
ADA.
We actually just went over ADA, and it's on the film right now, so that should be good. Anything else from up here? Make sure that you're familiar with Plessy. Do y'all remember what happened in Plessy versus Ferguson? Do you remember who Homer Plessy was?
Light skin, 1/8 black, 7/8 white.
Yeah, he was. It was basically saying that Homer Plessy's great-grandfather and great-grandmother were an interracial couple, and he was basically a couple of generations removed from that. So he was a very, very light-skinned, albeit legally, according to the law, considered to be a black man. And what did he buy a ticket to try and desegregate?
On a white car.
Train. He bought a ticket for the whites only car. And this was another example of, just like Dred Scott, if you remember, Dred Scott, they arranged a lawsuit and they lost. Homer Plessy told people that he was buying the wrong ticket, and then ultimately, in fact, not only did he tell them, but he was arrested for trying to buy the ticket on the wrong car. What was the legal principle that came from Plessy versus Ferguson?
Separate but equal.
Separate but equal is exactly what it was. And effectively what they said in this case was, okay, if you've got the same facilities, whether it's water fountains, whether it's bathrooms, whether it's train cars, as was in this case, and they didn't necessarily list all of these, but this is the statement of law for basically the first half of the 20th century. If you could separate the races as long as the provisions that you provided for them were equal. So again, water fountains, bathrooms, schools, law schools, I mean, you could go on, restaurant seating areas. And what they ended up finding when you got to Brown versus Board of Education was separate but equal was oftentimes very unequal, and that's why in Brown they struck down the Plessy versus Ferguson case. What can y'all tell me about Brown versus Board of Education? What was the test? Yeah, go ahead.
Wasn't it the little girl, she had to like walk like really far, like over train tracks and everything like that. It was like a
She did.
40-minute walk in order to get to school when there was a whites only school that was like right around the corner.
Yeah, her specific situation, this was Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, or Topeka, Kansas Board of Education. And if you go back to this particular case, she actually had a whites-only school that was basically right around the corner. And she just wanted to go to the school that was closer.
What was her full name?
Oh, don't worry about that for now. But for our purposes, I mean, basically what she was doing is she just wanted to go to the one that was closer. She actually had to walk, and like you said, there were railroad tracks. I mean, it got dark really early in the morning, or it got dark really early in the afternoon, depending upon the time of the year. She had to walk a long way. It wasn't particularly safe. And do you remember what they ultimately used? Go ahead, Tony.
They used dolls.
They used dolls. How did the doll test work?
They showed the black children dolls, and they asked them, which one do you want to do?
Okay, that's the beginning of an answer. Tell me more. Go ahead.
They asked which one are you, I think.
Okay, and they asked this to just the black children?
To both.
Okay, to both the black children and the
white children.
And the white children. So when they asked the white children, which doll are you, what did the white children say?
The white doll.
They said they were the white doll. When they asked them, which doll do you want to be, what did they say?
The white doll.
And when they asked the black children, what doll are you?
The black doll.
And what doll do you want to be?
The white doll.
And what was the conclusion that they drew from this?
That white girls were better, or white people were better.
White girls are better. Okay. Yeah, and you said that on tape. See, so that's really going to be bad. I don't think anybody's going to remember anything else, but white girls are better. Now I've just said it on tape. It wasn't actually that. What they basically said was separate but equal is inherently unequal. And the phrase that I used in class was separate but equal is stamping a badge of inferiority on these young children from such a young age that they're not ever going to be able to outgrow or outrun that. So keep that in mind, because if they know what they are, but they've been socialized that they need to be something else, that's separate but equal is inherently unequal, and ultimately they struck this down. They struck down separate but equal with Brown versus Board of Education. I mentioned to you that we are not going to deal with sexual harassment on this one. Do you remember what the squirrely issue was with the 1964 Civil Rights Act? Go ahead.
It didn't include women.
It didn't include women, or did it include women? Go ahead, Jean-Pierre.
Prohibits racial segregation in public accommodation, employment, education, and voting.
Ooh, yeah, it did. Prohibiting racial it prevented discrimination in all of these different categories that you'd mentioned. But there was a Virginia representative, do you remember, who didn't want this to pass. What did he put in there? He put gender in there. It was not actually originally included in there, but you're right, Tony, it was amended into there, and he's like, well, if we're going to give all these other people rights, let's just protect the women too. Well, he did it to kill the bill, and the joke ended up being on him because the bill was ultimately passed, and now that was included in federal law. So that's something that's now been around for, 53 years, but it wasn't added because they wanted you to have protection. They actually added it so that other groups would not, or they would be subject to discrimination. So kind of keep that thought in mind. Let's look at the articles really quick, and there are a frick load. Well, actually, let's look at the links here first. Y'all remember Tiger Fuzzy and the Collard Greens?
Yeah.
What was that all about? Go ahead, Matt.
It was when he made a comment about
Who?
Tiger Woods.
Who made the comment?
Fuzzy.
Fuzzy.
I don't remember his name.
Fuzzy. Oh, here we go. Fuzzy Zeller was the man. I think it's Zoellerer, but I may be wrong on that. Fuzzy Zeller was an older white golfer. And in fact, I believe this was the U.S. Open. And I believe this is the one, in fact, that this was Tiger's first tournament win. And you know how it is. If somebody is the hot shot, then in fact the older guard is going to get a little salty when they get a little bit too much attention. What was it, Matt, that Fuzzy said?
He said, just make sure that he doesn't serve fried chicken, or like collard. And then he walked away and he said, or collard greens or whatever the hell they serve.
Yeah, that's actually verbatim, almost word for word. Fuzzy Zeller was pretty salty about all this, and he said, "You go," and he called him something too. Do y'all remember?
Little boy.
Little boy. He said, "You tell that little boy, tell him not to serve fried chicken next year, or collard greens, whatever the hell they eat." And if you remember, this goes back to that Delaware Department of Transportation article that I had given you. And if you remember, there were certain things that you were not supposed to say to coworkers. Do you remember some of the things? Go ahead, Matt.
To old people, you couldn't say like, "Oh, when are you retiring?" or
When are
can
you
we
retiring?
plan-"
Okay,
or
go
like,
ahead.
"When can we plan your retirement party?" And then to, I guess, to Asian people, you can't ask where the best Asian food is around and things like that.
Okay, yeah, those were a couple of the pieces. You're not supposed to ask old people, "Hey, when are you retiring?" You're just keeping the seat warm for the next person. You know, Walmart is hiring for their next door greeter. These were things that you weren't supposed to say. Talking about Asian coworkers, you're not supposed to ask, "Oh, so where is the best Chinese restaurant?" And if you remember, with Seinfeld and the Native Americans, that clip that I had shown you, it actually dealt with somebody saying to the postman, "Where's the best Chinese restaurant?" when in fact he appeared to be Asian and he didn't take kindly to it. And we talked a little bit about that. Y'all remember anything else from the Delaware article? Things that you weren't supposed to say at work? Go ahead.
To a gay co-worker and they've thought about getting help.
You're not supposed to go to a gay coworker. "Oh, wow, you're gay. Have you ever thought about getting help for that?" No, not supposed to say that. Go ahead, Tony.
Asking a black person that fried chicken or watermelon.
Fried chicken or watermelon is what it mentioned. And like I said, that goes back to Tiger and Fuzzy. Because when we first started talking about this, a lot of people were like, "There's nothing wrong with asking somebody if they want some fried chicken." And then when you saw what Fuzzy did, and it wasn't necessarily that he said something wrong, but you could tell he was salty in the way that he said it. There's a difference there. Go ahead, Reed.
Wait, so are you saying that with the whole Delaware State Department things, this was set off by what?
No, I'm just saying this is a really good example of it, so I wouldn't say that this is related with it, but what I would say is this is an example of what we were talking about in that Delaware article. And it was the Delaware Department of that published this little flyer? Transportation. Delaware Department of Transportation. Can you think of anything else? Go ahead.
Can't tell a Latino to like help you with your lawn or something.
Yeah, you can't ask for help with your landscaping. That's a good point. I saw some other hands go up. Go ahead, Matt.
Oh, I was just gonna bring up the Biden thing, but if we're not there yet.
Yeah, let's hold off on the Biden thing. There were a number of pieces, though, that I had mentioned. Asking about a Mexican restaurant you weren't supposed to do. If you remember, we had talked a little bit about if somebody comes up to you and speaks a language that they think that you either speak or should speak, is that something that is a violation of political correctness or inappropriate? And to be honest with you, I think the answer that we got was, it depends. Sometimes maybe, but sometimes not. Go ahead.
I think another part of the Delaware policy was you are too articulate for whatever race you are.
Oh, has anybody ever asked, and this actually does go to black coworkers, it asked, it tells you, you're not supposed to say you speak well or you are articulate, which now, Matt, has opened the door to Joe Biden. What is it that Joe Biden did?
He said that he's clean And
Who's clean?
Obama. He was talking about Obama.
Talking about Obama.
During the race, saying that he was clean and articulate, and a few other things, but I'm not sure. I don't remember.
Joe Biden in talking about Barack, and effectively, if you go back and you look at this, Joe Biden had basically said that he's this first sort of mainstream, articulate, clean. I mean, this is a fairy tale, man. And to be honest with you, he caught 10 kinds of hell for saying this, because individually by themselves, these might not necessarily be bad things to say, but a number of y'all got upset when people had told you previously that you were articulate, because it made it sound like because of who you were or what you looked like, then you couldn't be or you weren't supposed to be articulate, which is kind of the point. We talked about Seinfeld.